welcome to our Daily Days Cemetery Tour, sponsored by the Lakeview Community Partnership, in conjunction with the Chamber and a whole lot of volunteers and wonderful people that helped with this event. Thank you all for being here and participating. And I'd like to introduce Dr. John Griffin, who is a renowned local historian that has been doing this tour for a very long time, and we're honored to have his expertise here to join us today. Lead us in this endeavor. So.
This fella here is too interesting to pass up. That's Jezreel Venator in 1880. He was not a young guy, but he found himself north of Alkali Lake about 4 miles, where today Venator Canyon is. There's nothing there. It's a little slot canyon. His horse got away from him during the summer. There was nobody living out there, and he tried to catch his horse. He couldn't. He didn't have water with him. He did find a juniper tree to sit under for a while. There's still family here. The family says he used a pocket knife to try and dig down to water, which wouldn't have done any good, and he died of thirst. Bad way to die.
Yeah.
By the way, if it bothers you to walk over graves and to stand on the graves of the dead, you already have, and you will be doing it a lot throughout this cemetery tour. It's just the way it is. We have many, many unmarked graves. This cemetery is essentially full, but you can see that there are a lot of open spaces. This was the first cemetery. A lot of wooden headboards. There's been a couple of fires go through here, and wooden headboards just deteriorate. So you're standing on the dead, you'll be walking on the dead. Now you might wonder, why is this cemetery here, this exact location? Well, he's one half of the reason. Him and his partner named Bill Martin, who does not have a headstone, were here from Jacksonville in 1869 hunting for what? Probably not deer, because there are deer in the Medford area. They're probably hunting for lamb. At that time, there were two households here. The Bullard household, Mark Bullard the first, and then the Petries, probably somewhere around the Mexican restaurant down to Snack Shack, somewhere in that area. Yeah.
How do you spell the Petrie?
Petree. Petrie. So that's what I used to call it until I was corrected about 3 weeks ago.
Is it related to the Petrie Swamp and Plush?
Yes. Right. They did not own up on their land here in Lakeview, but the family spread out. It was William Petrie that was the first. We will see his grave later on, but yes.
I always thought it was Petrie, like Petri dish, you know, like I thought it spelled like that, you know, like the laboratory style.
P-T-R-I.
I think it might be a little different, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wonder if they were still related to the Petrie Swamp.
Yes, they were out in the Plush area, that Werner Valley also. James Latta and Bill Martin were here looking for land. They were camped to the south somewhere. They went out hunting, didn't come back. And about 4 days later, they sent a party out looking for them. They didn't have to go very far, and they found them here. They didn't know what killed them. They weren't full of arrows or anything. They went through their pockets and they found that they had some wild parsnip in their pocket. And they figured that they might have eaten that. By the time they got here, they'd been laying out in the open for a few days and they were kind of putrid. So they dug a couple of graves and essentially they rolled them into it. And That's why the cemetery is here today. Here's where it started. The information came from a letter that was written by a nephew of Latta to somebody that surfaced, that was sent to the cemetery district, and Latta, his nephew, later on, I think it was him, came here to town and opened a grocery store. Also in this area you have Thomas Schick, who was a bartender in Paisley, and one day there was a poker game going on by a man named Flynn, I think, and a William Brown, a sheep herder, and they had a dispute over a winning hand. They had an argument, and they took their hands up to the bartender, Thomas Schick, and said, "Who won this hand?" And Schick said, "Flynn did." Brown, who was a sheep herder, walked about 2 to 3 miles back to his camp, got a rifle, walked back to the Paisley bar, and shot Schick between the eyes with his rifle. He was, the body was brought here. You kind of wonder why he wasn't, buried in Paisley. Probably because they had to do an autopsy, and it was cheaper to ship the body here to a doctor. And he did the autopsy, and nobody was particularly interested in having him back. And, they buried him at county expense.
Where was that?
What?
What year?
That would have been 1888, I believe. 87 or 88. The second murder in Lake County where somebody actually went to prison. Brown was tried, and the first trial was a hung jury. How it was a hung jury, I have no idea. But it was. So you'd see that a lot more in Lake County history. They said, "Okay, we're going to try you again, and we are going to try you as a capital crime, possible hanging offense." And he pled guilty. He got a life sentence. Now, most of the time, back then, a life sentence for murder involved honestly serving about 8 years. You think the Wild West was tougher? Well, it was tougher on horse thieves, but it was not tougher on murder. If you got a life sentence, you usually served around 8 years. 11 years after the crime, in 1899, Brown was still in the state prison. It used to be common practice if the county commissioner went to Salem on some type of business, they would stop by the prison and the insane asylums to see how our local residents were doing. And they stopped by and they saw Brown, and it was Stephen Moss, who was a Paisley gentleman serving on the commissioners, who visited him and said, "God, I didn't recognize him, because in the prison you've got to be clean shaven and your haircut and so on." I guess as a sheep herder, he wasn't that clean. Bill Martin does not have a headstone, but there are people all over here. There is a marker right there for a Patchen child. Patchen was a district attorney here. If you rode through town too fast, he would try and cite you. If you swore out loud, he would try and cite you. 3 of them died in 1 year of diphtheria. We know this not because of newspaper accounts, because very few newspapers survived from that period, but because in the 1870 and 1880 censuses, they did what was called a mortality census, and everybody that had died in the previous one calendar year, they wrote down the date and the cause of death. And all these children died of diphtheria. Many graves here are from childhood deaths of childhood. Well, diphtheria wasn't necessarily a childhood disease, but if you died of diphtheria, you were probably a child. In Lakeview, Lake County, many deaths from typhoid fever, usually in the fall when the levels in the wells went down. Scarlet fever killed a lot of children, even chicken pox and measles. And then the Great Flu epidemic hit in 1918, but we'll talk about that later. There's a large gray headstone right yonder. Morris Wingfield was a cowboy. He was out in the Adel area, and his horse fell in a slough near Pelican Lake, which is just north of Adel. Great duck hunting if you can get permission. The O'Keefe's own it. At least two others in the Warner Valley died when their horses went down in the slough somewhere. Maybe three others. Very common. Wingfield never achieved any kind of fame, but his brother George Wingfield was definitely a local boy that made good. They were raised in the Cogswell Creek area south of town. George was a cowboy, went on a trail drive to Winnemucca and stayed, worked in the area, and eventually got interest or ownership of a saloon in Golconda, which is a little to the east of Winnemucca. And from there, in partnership with the guy last name Nixon, he expanded his empire to saloons and later mining in Nevada to the point that he was by far and away the wealthiest man in Nevada, enough to influence politics of the state. They said he owned the state. He went bust at least once, but made more money and was wealthy. A big contributor to the University of Nevada, Reno, in his later years. Definitely George Wingfield was a local boy who did very, very well. We're going to go over to those trees right there in the corner. Right around in here is William S. Thompson, the only one that I know of that was lynched in Lakeview. This was in August of 1894. William S. Thompson, excuse my language, but was one dirty son of a bitch. When he was sober. When he was drunk, he was worse. I've met people whose grandparents knew him, and the grandparents described to them saying he was the meanest man that ever lived. Lived out in the Adel area. There's still a Thompson Field out there to the south of Adel. And had a wife, 2 kids, and his neighbors were afraid of him. He was just a very mean, cruel man. And stories go around that at least once his neighbors tried to kill him. Ambush him. Some people hid in the willows with rifles, hoping that he would ride by with another guy. And the other guy was in on it, and Thompson would never let anybody ride behind him. And this guy wanted to ride behind him because he said, I'll be up in front, to his friend. And Thompson, nope, nobody rides behind me. Well, they rode past those willows and nobody shot, but there was probably a cowboy shaking in his boots the whole time. At one point, his son, Thompson's son, swallowed caustic lye. And they rushed him to a doctor in Fort Bidwell, not any closer than Lakeview, but easier to get to. And they tried to save him, but they could not. Later, the newspapers, in building up a case against Thompson, would say that he killed his own son. Not true. But he did enough other things. He got drunk in 1894 and beat up his wife very badly, supposedly broke her nose and a few ribs, then went out, took a knife, and slashed up some of his own horses and cattle. The warrant for his arrest still exists. It was found with a bunch of other old county records, some of which predate Lake County. It was still Jackson County that were found in the dump. Fortunately, Jack Glenn, don't know if any of you know him, was working for Lakeview Lumber at the time and took a load of lumber trash to the dump and recognized a bunch of leather-bound volumes and the cardboard containers the documents came into, and loaded them into a Lakeview Lumber truck on company time. He was scared, and this was during snow season, and brought him back to his house. His wife was curator of the Snake Museum at the time. I live across the street from him. We put them out on their floor to dry some of them out, but most of them were in excellent shape. Today, those records are at the museum, Snake Museum, known as the Dump Records. And by the way, in case you were wondering, it looks like the Snake Museum, which is now closed, will become the property of Lake County, and the Lake County Museum will be in charge. The warrant for his arrest charges him only with slashing his horses and cattle, not for beating up his wife. See, some things were better back then. Anyway, he was brought into town, lodged in the jail, and a bunch of locals from the South Warner Valley, Adel area, came into town, supposedly camped at the mouth of Bullard Creek, and waited till nightfall, broke into the jail, and tossed him off the second floor with the rope around his neck, and lynched him. Everybody pretty much knew who did it. Nobody was ever charged.
He fell.
So, I talked to a stepdaughter of Thompson's daughter about a year and a half ago. Lived in Surprise Valley, and they didn't know the reason he had been arrested. They thought it was horse theft. He was kind of wanted from the Prineville area for horse theft, but really it was for slashing his own horses and cattle. The section seems to have a lot of Indian graves. Bonnie Washoe, don't know anything about her. Definitely an Indian. There were, as soon as there were white people moving in here and the town was established, Indians came in. From 1864 to 1868, no white people living here because the Northern Paiutes and the Snake Indians were at war, and they'd have killed you if you tried to settle here. Probably the first people here came in the fall of 1868. Mark Bullard, dates unclear, after the Indians had pretty much been whipped by about June of 1868. It would have been unsafe to try and come here earlier. The Indians that came into town, there was a bunch that lived at the mouth of Bullard Creek up on the side of the hill. There are photos of their camp, Lakeview John, etc. The women did washing, house cleaning, etc. The men would do haying, other chores. A lot of them out in the Warner Valley did work for the ranchers, haying, etc. Here in town, if you read the old newspaper accounts, problems with alcohol abuse. It was a serious offense to sell liquor to an Indian. It could get you into prison or get you a hefty fine, and they did enforce it. It was serious, but they still managed to get liquor, and there were problems. Also in here is an unmarked grave of A.J. Haynes. Whenever you hear initials from the 19th century of A.J., H.C., or G.W., you don't need to write out the name. You automatically know what it is. A.J. is Andrew Jackson. G.W. is George Washington. H.C. Henry Clay. Not so popular now. But A.J. Haynes actually had a post office named after him in Klamath County, I think around the Bonanza area. He was a very, very fervent Baptist, to the point of getting under your skin, especially if you live in Catholic country. I've talked to relatives of his who, by the way, keep promising to get him a headstone, and I bring it up every year. They think that's why he was killed. He was actually accidentally shot up in Bull Prairie by a guy named Barney Grumman. They were both working for the Rehart Ranch, and they mounted their horses, and when Barney Grumman mounted his horse, he slung his rifle up, and the rifle went off. And it hit A.J. Haynes kind of in the back, in the kidney area. They got him down to the Rehart Ranch in Crooked Creek, and on his deathbed, he said Barney didn't mean to do it. It was an accident, and he was not tried. Numerous gun accidents are buried in here, at least 3 where a guy was going through a barbed wire fence, and it went off and killed him.
Can you tell us about what date that grave would have been, the Haynes?
Haynes, I'm guessing around 1905, 1906,
Okay.
that time period.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if you can't, it's not indexed, but there are at both museums obituaries, and they are indexed, and you'll find out a lot of this information. If you see a headstone and it's got a date of death on it, March 12, 1904, online, free, is Oregon historic newspapers. And these are photos of the actual newspapers, and they're awful to try and read. But you can get the information for free from 1900 on. Also in the newspaper office, if you know a date, they have newspapers from 1900 on.
1899.
1899.
1899 on. Okay. So there are a lot of sources. 1880, which is when the first newspaper was established, to 1900. Not all of them survived by any stretch, but there is a microfilm of it from the University of Oregon in the Lake County Museum. Once again, it's microfilm. You go blind reading it, but it is there. His grandmother, Maggie John, wife of Lakeview John. Maggie was also known as Indian Maggie. She was inherited, you might say, by Lakeview John when her first husband, Plush, died.
Is that Poker Jim Plush?
Might have been. Supposedly, he was the one that Plush was named after.
Right.
Is that Poker Jim or
No.
it's not Poker Jim?
I've heard different stories about
Yeah, I
Poker
don't know.
Jim Ridge. There was a Poker Jim, an Indian down in Bidwell named Poker Jim. The story that I've heard on Poker Jim Ridge is that there was a white guy in the Warner Valley named Jim Dobson. Now, I cannot trace him, never found any trace of him.
Dobson's Cahill's. Frank Cahill, their ranch is the Dobson Ranch.
D-O-B?
Yeah, S-O-N.
Okay, I'll ask him about that, because supposedly Jim Dobson was named Poker Jim, not because he played cards, but because he had a cane or he would poke you in the stomach. That's the story I heard. I don't know if it's true. But there was an Indian in Bidwell named Poker Jim. But anyway, Maggie was inherited by Lakeview John. When his brother died, that was the custom. Lakeview John was jailed for a time in Lakeview for beating up his wife and breaking her on. So marital relations weren't the best. Maggie John, I mentioned they had some alcohol problems. She would die on the streets of Lakeview during the winter when she got drunk, passed out on the street, and froze to death.
She washed clothes for our great grandmother.
She's what?
She washed clothes for our great grandmother.
Oh, okay. Oh, and by the way, this tour, you know, most of the people in here are just like us. We're born, we work, we get married, have kids, get old, get sick, and die. And that's about it. But this tour pretty much covers the more lurid, more interesting, either lives or deaths. You know, someday when I die, I will not be part of this tour. Did retire here, lived up on Hart Mountain, spent winters in Lakeview, where he would run up a large bill at the Post and King Saloon during the winter. You can find that out if you go to his probate record. That's my mother-in-law. My favorite grave in the whole cemetery. John Foley, this is the first government headstone I ever got for anybody. He was a soldier at Camp Warner, about 40 miles from here.
Art Mountain one or the Honey Creek?
No, the Honey Creek one. Yeah, he enlisted in '66 after the Civil War in New York City. Given occupation soldier, so he was probably in the Civil War, which ended in '65, and enlisted. But there were numerous John Foleys from New York that had enlisted in the Union Army. It's hard to trace him. He was an Irish immigrant. He was illiterate. In spite of being illiterate, he still made it up from private to corporal a couple of times. You'd hardly ever make it up to sergeant because you had to be able to read. But make it up to corporal and then get busted back, in his case, for drunkenness. One time he was in the sleeping quarters, the barracks, and was drunk and loud, and when the sergeant came to tell him to be quiet, he called the sergeant a son of a bitch, which was a much worse insult back then than it is now. Well, he got stuck in the guardhouse, busted back to private, and fined, I think, $5, which when you're making $16 a month, $5 is quite a bit. He liked his whiskey, which would have cost 25 cents, half a day's pay, for 2 shots at the Sutler's store, or $1.50 for a quart, which is 3 days' salary. He ended up committing what the Army considered a serious offense when he was on guard. He was part of the guard, which meant you were on duty for 24 hours straight. 2 hours on guard duty, 2 hours off, in which you could sit in the guardhouse, the jail, so to speak, not behind bars, but on benches. But you had to stay buttoned up, all buttons, including collar buttons, wool, even in the summer. And then the 2 hours you were on duty, you were posted in front of the stables or somewhere. You might even be guarding prisoners. But guard duty was considered serious. You read the records and you get the impression that guys could drink on duty, but you couldn't get drunk. And you really couldn't get drunk if you were part of the guard detail. He was arrested for visiting the Sutler's store, which was a store that sold candy, canned sardines, food items, but especially liquor. He visited this Sutler's store numerous times while he was corporal of the guard, which means he got drunk on guard duty. He was stuck in the guardhouse, and they, for a long time, not that the offense necessarily was serious enough to lock him up for a long time, they could not get enough officers together to hold a court-martial. I think it required 5. And they just couldn't get enough of them together. So he was in the guardhouse for quite a while. When he finally got out, when he was finally court-martialed, he was busted back and fined $15 or something. He was discharged in 1870, and I knew he had been at Camp Warner. I wanted to get him a headstone, but I couldn't find out when he died. And so went through courthouse records, and he had been issued a voucher. He was a sheep herder, and his boss, a guy named Charles Smith, died. And the coroner had to do an inquest. I don't know how he died, but he had to testify. And he got a $1 voucher for it. And he never redeemed it. And this was in January of 1886. So I wrote a letter with the headstone saying, I don't know exactly when he died, but I think it was 1886, and here's the reason why. I sent it. I didn't think they'd send the headstone. But about a month later, the headstone arrived. 1886 on the death day. And about 2 years after that, I was in the U of O, and a new microfilm showed up of newspapers from Lake County. And it was from UC Berkeley. And I thought, wow, cool. Went through it, immediately went to 1886. One newspaper.
Oh.
No mention of John Foley.
Yeah.
So I thought, hell, let's try 1887. Went to 1887. 2 newspapers from the whole year.
Wow.
The first one I looked at, there was no obituary, but in the About Town column, there was a little blurb that said, it's sad to note that a sheep herder named John Foley died Thursday night. He died from an overdose of whiskey. So he didn't learn.
No.
He didn't. He never got over it. Over there is C.F. Pope. The first murder victim, where a guy actually went to prison for his murder. He went to Jammerthal's Brewery, which, Kurt, I believe you said it was near the Chevron station. Yeah. The bartender was named Al Scherfen, a short, about 40-year-old German immigrant with a pompadour hairstyle. That's what his prison record says, and a little overweight. He was the bartender. C.F. Pope came in, and he was evidently a cowboy, already drunk, and loud and obnoxious, and swearing. And Scherfen, the bartender, told him, keep it down, be civilized. And Pope probably called him a son of a bitch or something. And Scherfen got angry and came around the bar and confronted him face to face and told him to shut up. And Pope slapped him with an open hand. Scherfen pulled out an English bulldog pistol and shot him in the chest and killed him. There was no trial. Scherfen pled guilty. He received a 4-year sentence, and he served a little less than 2. Probably when they let him out, they told him to leave the state. And he went down to Alturas. He actually owned land down near Canby, and he had been a postmaster in a post office down there named for his wife, who would divorce him while he was in prison. But after he got out in the 1890s, a blurb would appear in the Lakeview paper, or Alturas paper, saying there was some excitement at the so-and-so saloon last Tuesday night. A pistol fell out of Al Scherfen's pocket and discharged on the floor. He was a barkeeper at a saloon. And he kept up his old habit. Also, over in that area is Louisa Logan. She would have been about a 24, 26-year-old prostitute. Died of a laudanum overdose. Laudanum is liquid opium. The coroner determined that it was accidental. It was not intentional suicide. pregnancy being an occupational hazard of, a prostitute, she may have been trying to abort herself. If you got the dose right, you could abort yourself with laudanum, but you had to get the dose right. She was arrested at one point, arrested twice. Once for prostitution, $100 fine, along with 3 or 4 other prostitutes, but she evidently continued to ply her trade, and was once arrested for stealing 2 bottles of beer, toll price 50 cents. And they actually did all the paperwork and so on. It amazes me for 50 cents. But this was gotten by 5th, 6th grade student.
Kyle and me.
Kyle Dieter. How old was he?
4th, 5th grade.
4th, 5th grade. I did not help him. I may have told him what forms to get, but did it all. So, Mark Shelton, 6th Texas Infantry, Confederate. A little bizarre that he has an American flag, seeing as to how he wanted to separate, but went to the beginnings of Baylor College in Waco, Texas, served in what would become the Texas Rangers to a degree, not catching criminals, but Indians on the frontier. When the Civil War started, he became a 3rd lieutenant and rose up to be a lieutenant. When the Civil War ended, he surrendered with his regiment, and he wrapped the regimental colors of his regiment around his body, put on his uniform, probably signed the Oath of Allegiance and all that, and saved the flag and later donated it to the state of Texas, and it was the first Civil War Texas regimental flag to go into the museum. He would become an attorney, served as an attorney in Lakeview. Prior to that, he was an attorney in Petaluma, had a wife, some children. His wife and children stayed in Petaluma. He came up here. Somehow they got divorced at some point. I don't think he ever married here. He did get into alcohol, and though he was evidently a good attorney when he was sober, in his later years, he became dependent on the hospitality of others to stay alive, and died broken, maybe drunk.
Did he have any children?
He had children down in Petaluma with his wife, yeah. She, I believe, later remarried, yeah. Okay. There are some interesting ones on the west section. But usually, I think we're going to primarily deal with this. We're going to go down there a little bit. But I think this half is a little more interesting, and it's also shaded. And when we set the date and time for this, it was a few weeks ago. And even at 6, 7 o'clock, it can be pretty uncomfortable out in the sun here. It's not tonight, but it can be. So we will get down in there a little bit. If any of you ever want a Western tour, it's a little more repetitious. There's more open spots. You see that open field there? It looks empty. It's not. That's the paupers' field at one time. Those were county burials, the poor. If they would have had some kind of marker, undoubtedly would, which would have deteriorated and been gone. But it's full. There's 20 marked graves in one section over there. There's 22 burials. It is jam-packed, but you sure wouldn't know. There are a lot of open spaces there. Now, some of those people lived some pretty good lives, pretty interesting lives. But overall, I think this section's a little more interesting. If you ever want to get enough together, I'll do it. By the way, I don't charge. Myself, I don't charge. I do it for free. Get together 4 people, I'll give you a tour of this nesting. This is Jimmy Johnson, about a 6-year-old boy. He was run over by a house. They were moving a house up by the swimming pool. This is way back when. They put it on logs, had it being hauled by horses. They'd taken the door off. He was a little kid. He went and jumped in and couldn't get up. And it ran over him. He actually lived for an hour or so and told what happened, and then he died. Sam Lewis. It was in the newspaper and so on a few weeks ago. He went in an unmarked grave for years and years and years. And they finally got a headstone for him. I'm sure he had a wooden marker originally. There was a considerable feud in 1882 in Lake County between the Laws and the Calavan families. The Laws lived near Bonanza, which was part of Lake County at the time, and the Calavans actually lived near Beaver, but they ran cattle during the winter in the Bonanza area. And one time, the father, Callahan, the head of the family, was passing by the Laws Ranch, and he looked in and he saw either one of his own cattle or one of his own horses in the Laws corral. And he confronted Laws about it and said, "What the hell's my property doing, my horse doing in your corral?" And then he started looking at the other horses and recognized some of his neighbors' horses. There was an argument that Laws eventually turned over the property. A short time after that, in a store, Calavan was talking to another customer and describing Laws as a horse thief. And Laws overheard it and grabbed a piece of wood and swung at his head. At the last moment, Calavan ducked, but he got a broken shoulder. And relations got even worse after that. During the winter, Laws was herding a group of about 30 cattle in snow, maybe that deep, along a very narrow trail near his ranch. And there was only enough space on this trail for one animal to go at a time. And he ran into 2 of the Calavan sons, Franklin and Jim. And evidently the local etiquette was if somebody was herding cattle, you kind of got out of the way of them, stepped off to the side. The 2 Calavan boys refused to do that. And there were words and so forth, but they did eventually pass each other. But both parties were growing pissed. And then the story differs as to who fired first. Laws had a rifle, the Calavan boys supposedly had pistols, and the guy with the rifle won. He shot the Calavan boy, Franklin, in the back. Didn't kill him immediately, and I think he shot the horse of Jim, the oldest boy. Laws, HC, Henry Clay, was himself shot in the leg. Franklin made it to a line cabin and laid down in the bed and died. And things got worse from there. People took sides. Well, they decided to try Laws for Franklin's murder. And he was originally, brought before a grand jury in Lakeview. But nothing quite happened. But when they were getting together witnesses, all the witnesses were over in the Klamath area, so they decided to have a hearing there. And they did it in a hotel in what would later be Klamath Falls. They took Laws over there with his attorney and a deputy and a couple of other people, and they were staying in a hotel, and a bunch from the Beaver area and perhaps Bonanza rode up with the intention of lynching Laws, hauling them out and hanging them. They broke in, the lights were blown out. Lewis supposedly got off some shots. It was pitch black. There was a shotgun blast, and then everything went kind of quiet. They said that you could hear blood dripping on the ground. Lewis got hit in the thigh and presumably the groin with a shotgun blast and died within about 5 minutes. They brought his body back here. They brought Laws back here. The grand jury heard the Laws case, and of course, the grand jury, being from Lakeview, where he was, probably were not too sympathetic to the Calavans, and Laws was found, it was not a case. The Calavans then petitioned Modoc County, California, to try Laws. The argument being that either Laws was about 15 yards in California and shot the Calavan boy across the state line, or vice versa. The Modoc County grand jury heard that and said, no. He's already been tried by a grand jury up there. No. Plus, they didn't want the expense of a trial. So seemingly nothing's going to go from this, but it wasn't over yet. Later on, 2 of Law's sons would be at a line shack, and there was like a quarter of beef hanging on the front porch, and the youngest son stepped out to cut off a piece of meat, and a shot rang out, and he dropped. His oldest brother, Lee, stepped out to see what happened, and he got shot too. Certainly, Calavan was probably involved, and supposedly the oldest Calavan son later on confessed to a couple people that he did do it. Laws would later on just decide to hell with it all, and supposedly he went to Salina, Utah, which is odd because Salina, if he's a rancher, Salina, Utah is solid Mormon country. Southern Utah, solid. And it makes you wonder, well, was Laws a Mormon? And if so, was there religious undertones to this? But I don't know. The Calavans nobody was ever brought to justice. Supposedly, when he was shot, they found a piece of scalp on the floor from some red-headed guy that would have been with the Calavan bunch, but they never really found a body. And nobody was ever brought to justice. It's nice to see that he finally got a headstone. Any questions on that? The Shaw Historical Society has an excellent write-up on it. And when it was submitted, the headstone came rather quickly, and the story was he was an old fella who lived down along Goose Lake and lived alone, one-room shack, had 80 acres, was retired, getting a Civil War pension, and he would almost every day visit his neighbors because he knew that the wife was baking bread. Yeah, sad story and so on. Well, there's more to this guy's story. It was said that he would never talk about his family. And the only thing he would say is that, yeah, he was in the Civil War. Well, he was in the Civil War. He came west. He was married. He had children. He ended up in the Pacific County area of Washington, north of South Bend, Washington, right on the border with the next county up. I believe it's Grays Harbor County. And he had a small farm ranch in rainforest country in the middle of nowhere. And he had a job of collecting the mail and taking it to a transit place where it would be distributed. On his property, there was a trail that went by, and there was a shed. Some dispute as to whether that was on his property or just off that shed. But people traveling that trail would get into this shed under shelter when it rained. Well, hell, it rains all the time up there. It just does. And he didn't like it. Yorks didn't like it, so he burned down the shed. And he was then, some people complained about that, at the town of Cosmopolis, Washington, which I think is in Grays Harbor County. They complained to the sheriff, who decided to send a note, can you come up here, we need to talk. And Yorks showed up. Well, there was more going on. But before I get into that, I should say that there was a guy going up a river in a rowboat with some money a few months before incidents happened that disappeared in the area of Yorix's home. But anyway, to get back to Cosmopolis, went into the sheriff's office, and a lot of people, by the way, thought Yorix was crazy, insane. And so they had a doctor there with the intention of interviewing him and declaring him insane and having him committed. And by the way, he had already been committed once before to the insane asylum. Well, they sat him down and they noticed that he had a pistol sticking out of his belt. And because they realized it's probably going to be emotional, they said, would you give over the pistol during this interview? He said, no. They said, well, why? And he goes, I can't hand this pistol over to anybody except a U.S. postal officer or a federal officer, because the pistol was issued to me by the U.S. Post Office to use to protect the mail. And he refused to do it. They decided to grab him. And he shot the marshal, shot the town marshal. And they continued to try and grab him, and he shot until the gun was empty and threw it at him, ran down the street. They shot him in the leg, and he threw rocks at him and everything until they tackled him and arrested him. And he was tried and sentenced to life in the Walla Walla State Prison. And that's him. and he was not a young man. He would have been 60-something. Sent to Walla Walla. While he was there, his wife died. And the obituary was really interesting. It said that Elizabeth York, also known as Texas Kitty. When a woman had a nickname like Texas Kitty, in those days, you could kind of guess what her occupation was.
Seamstress.
I looked her up. Yep. In 1900, she was running a body house, a house of ill repute in Astoria, Oregon. And when he was imprisoned, she went back to doing that in Astoria, and she died there. He was in prison. Somebody else bought or leased the ranch. While they were digging up the garden to replant the garden, they ran into a skeleton. And it had been killed by a shotgun blast to the face. And they figured it was that guy that had been rowing up the creek. In those days, if you were convicted of murder and sentenced to the prison, it was not at all unusual to get a support group back home to start writing letters on your behalf, saying things like, yeah, Mark shot the guy in the back, but geez, he's really a nice guy when he's sober, and things like that. And that's what happened in this case. And there was the part about him being set up for a possible trip to the insane asylum. He got retried and was released. He went to South Bend, was going to stay there, and then abruptly turns up here. Why? My guess is it had to do with the skeleton in the garden. He was not charged with it. He got out and did not seem to want to trail back to anyone as to his whereabouts. Because the federal government knew where he was because he was getting attention. But, yeah, interesting guy. Dr. Daly came here in the 1880s. There's been some stories that he was an army doctor beforehand. No. He seemed to have come here right after medical school, went to the University of Alabama. He was Irish, but he came here at a very early age. That piece of paper with this picture pretty much says it all. Doctor, lawyer, judge, statesman, legislator, rancher, philanthropist. He was all of those things and was very successful, never married, though he did have a girlfriend, Pearl Hall. When he passed away, he started the Daly Fund, but that was not his whole will. He did take care of his girlfriend also. If you have one person that's had the greatest impact on Lake County, it would have to be Dr. Daly. So many benefited from his will and the Daly Fund. It is not easy to go to college from Lake County. It just isn't. The colleges are too far away and it's too expensive. He's done so much to make it possible for so many for so long. And a great man. And that's the end of the tour.